Great, so let's do this. Welcome, everybody. It's so excited to have you all in class today. Today, we are going to go over the Constitutional Convention, the 101 of the Constitution. How did we get it? Who was involved, and what did they put in? My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the National Constitution Center. And I'm so excited today because as we do this lecture, we are actually at the National Constitution Center. This is not a virtual image. I'm actually in the building, which is a recreation of the moment of the signing of the United States Constitution. I am here with our top scholar, Tom Donnelly. Tom is going to walk us through the history of how these guys got to this moment, and then what did they do during the convention, that long, hot, I'm going to say it, mellow summer. So Tom, do you want to say hello to students?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Can't wait to get started.
Awesome. So three big kind of like guiding questions that we have for today's class is, why did the founding generation decide to write a constitution? What was going on and what brought them to this kind of moment, this big peak moment in time? How did the United States Constitution differ from the Articles of Confederation? And if you don't know what the Articles of Confederation are, no worries, you will by the end of class. And then finally, what were some of the big compromises that happened in this room to get the Constitution to a point where they could send it back to the states for ratification? So really quickly, we thought it would be fun to do what we love at the National Constitution Center and start with we the people. And here are some of the people, so hopefully you took your Dramamine and you're all not gonna get car sick on me. But I'm gonna do a 360 here of the room, and you can shout out in the chat if you see anybody that might look familiar. You can see that big tall guy behind me. I'm actually this short and he's actually that tall. Yell out who you think he is. There's a little guy beside him that's kind of important. Roger Sherman is behind me. You might not know who he is. This room is filled with a lot of important people. They are all the delegates that were there on the day of the signing of the United States Constitution, some who signed and some who refused to sign. So we're gonna kind of weave them in, and Tom's gonna tell you the backstory and I'll get you close to the people. One of the things that you might notice, again, you might notice that guys like Gouverneur Morris are really tall, because I'm about 5 foot tall, just so you have a frame of reference. And Gouverneur Morris is about 6'2", 6'3". He's very, very tall. He's leaning over to talk to somebody you might recognize, that guy right there, who's sitting down. He's the oldest delegate in the room at the time at 81. So we'll tell you who everybody's names are, but feel free to keep guessing. One really fun thing about this room is that they're accurate. So the height that they are, the size that they are, historians and artists work together to make these statues, and they are as accurate as we historically knew when they built the room 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, they did a whole bunch of research and they looked at what Washington was wearing that day, and they recreated everything, and they made a statue of Washington that would have been about his size, shape, and spot when he was at the Constitutional Convention. I think he's about 55 years old, Tom, is that right?
I think that's about right, yeah.
Yeah, we can look at the plaque later because it tells us at the bottom, but at the average age. So as you notice them, we want you to use like all your senses. Look and see what you notice about them. Wonder what you think, like, why are they standing with that guy? And what are they doing over there? And what are the questions you have around them as we go through these stories of the convention? So Tom, back to you. Kind of, why did they come here? Why did Washington come to Philadelphia in 1787? What was going on in our country, and what was the precipice? Big word, my favorite word. What was the kind of the energy that brought them to this moment?
Well, thanks so much, Kerry. The one thing I'll add to what Kerry said is it is an amazing experience just to be a Constitution nerd and walk into that room and literally see all these life-size statues there. And really, you get a sense, even, I'm not sure if you could feel it, but where Kerry's standing now, just how Washington is bigger, taller, more imposing than pretty much anyone else in the room. Yeah, exactly. There's Washington. And so you feel that with and then James Madison, the shorter figure right to his side there, which Kerry will stand next to right there. But like there's just, it brings to life their humanity and sort of what it must have felt like to be at the Constitutional Convention. So how did they get there? So one thing to note, obviously, is that before the Constitutional Convention, before the United States Constitution, we had a framework of government. We had a national government that we were living under since the Declaration of Independence during the American Revolution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. Now, if there's one thing to know about the Articles of Confederation, it's that it created a weak, 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 weak national government. It was a weak national government. So what they described it as was, it was a league of friendship. So how do we think about this? Well, I like to think of it as the Articles of Confederation setting up something closer to the United Nations than the United States of America. So these really were, they felt a lot like separate nations here, united to rebel against the British, but really content to go their own ways largely after that. And so the Articles preserved as much state power, state independence as possible. So why might they want that? Well, remember, we just fought a revolution to cast off an elitist, distant, out of touch, powerful government. And we didn't just fight that revolution to want to put another one in place in America. And so we wanted to keep power in the states. So what are some of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? Well, one is it didn't have the power, it didn't have so many of the things we think of today as essential to a national government. It didn't have the power to tax. It didn't have the power to regulate economic relations between the states. It didn't have the power to raise an army, to tell states, send us some troops to help protect America. It didn't have the power to force states to send money to fund the national government. The national government had to go to the states and say, please send us money. We can't tax, please send us money. And you can imagine how well that went. And so you have this national government where there just is not very much power. The other thing I'll note, because it's significant as we get to the convention, is the structure of this national government. And that's that it's a Congress. The entire national government is a Congress that's, although it doesn't have a lot of power, all of the power is concentrated there. So it's a single Congress. There's not a US House and a US Senate, so it's a single Congress. There's no separate president. There's no separate judicial branch, so no separate Supreme Court. It's just this Congress that's tasked with, as best it can, representing the interests of all of the states in the Union. And the last thing, Kerry, is that in order, so this, you may think, you know, sure, they set up this document. Well, won't they learn over time, like good children of the Enlightenment, to make it better? Won't they improve as they learn from the mistakes of some of the structures they put in place? But one of the biggest mistakes made with the Articles of Confederation is to amend the document. They required that every state agree to an amendment. It was a unanimous amendment requirement, which, as any of you know who've tried to make a decision in groups of people in your lives, whether it's your family, your classmates, or anything, unanimity is pretty much impossible. Imagine when the stakes are changing the very structure of one's governing document. As a result, no amendments happened to the Articles of Confederation. So that's the Articles. The other thing, Kerry, and you have it up here, and it's great to remember, is that the states themselves have also during this period established their own state governments. And so for so many of the leading figures of the revolution, of the founding, this is where the action was. They go back, they're in their states. They have the power to be the people who write the constitutions of the most important government to them, their state governments. And so what do these state governments do? What sort of state governments do we set up? Well, generally speaking, we would say these state governments have really, really, really strong state legislatures. And these state legislatures are designed to really, really hear the voice of the people. So there's a tight connection between the people in the states and their state legislature, and a lot of the powers being lodged there, and very, very weak governors. So strong state legislatures, close to the people, very democratic for their day, and very weak governors. And so what happens with this? Well, the main problems that people like Washington, Madison, Hamilton are really concerned about are the policies these state governments are putting in place. So as the revolution winds on, as the revolution comes to an end, we have a major economic crisis in America. So the economy is doing really, really poorly. And so for so many Americans, you know, for the governments, for the national government, for the state governments, they have a lot of debt and not a lot of money. And then if you're looking at it from the perspective of the ordinary American farmer, they have a lot of debt. They're forced to pay very high state taxes, and they have no money. And so what do the state governments do? Well, they pass things like debt relief laws. So saying that if you owe people a lot of money, we're not going to force you to pay it back. So in a sense, helping the debtors, but harming, you know, the creditors, the banks, the people with money. The other, the other big thing is that you have states trying to protect their own businesses. And so they're passing all sorts of laws that make it good for businesses from your own state and bad for businesses from other states trying to do business in your state. So this puts up trade barriers between the states, which also harms the national economy. And so, again, just to highlight where does the convention, the Constitution, and the Articles come into this? Well, these are a series of problems that many people recognize, but the Articles simply don't have the power to address them. They don't have the power to tax. They don't have the power to regulate economic relations between the states. They don't have the power to act. They don't have the power to amend the document. And so there's this friction between, on the one hand, many people not wanting a government that's a national government that's all powerful, but many people also realizing the Articles don't work. And so what brings us to the precipice of the convention here, Kerry? It's Shay's Rebellion. It's for people like Washington, for people like Hamilton, for people like Madison, this concern that we might move towards mob rule. And so what happens with Shay's Rebellion?
Yeah, I just want to
I'm sorry, Kerry, yes.
Yeah, I want to do one quick wrap up because I think Shay's Rebellion is a great example of the violence that pops out of this disconnect between the states. So what Tom just kind of laid out for you is that we're living under this kind of loose league of friendship, kind of like just a deal we all made with each other. The states are like different countries. And we're saying, okay, we'll work together for the revolution. But after the revolution, it's not working because we need to work as a team. What I think is really, really important is, and why we get the Shay's Rebellion, is we're almost losing it all. It's not just that we're fighting between each other and we can't work together. Trade economy is not working. There's debt. All this thing is so bad between the states. But we've got other major countries like Portugal, like Spain, like Britain coming back in on us and squishing down upon us, blocking our rivers, our waterways, picking our sailors off of boats and forcing them into the Navy. All these things are happening and we have no way to protect ourselves. We have no way to protect ourselves internally from each other and no way as a group to protect ourselves against the rest of the world and really be a nation. So Shay's Rebellion, I know everybody loves to talk about Shay's Rebellion. And the reason why I like to talk about it is think about it like a case study. It's not the only time something like this happened, but it's a really good example of how bad it was. And you can see a little bit of fighting amongst peers. So Tom gives the rundown of Shay's Rebellion and how it affected the fact that Washington was going to come and Madison could talk him into coming to the convention.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's begin with Washington and then go into Shay's Rebellion. So there are, even before Shay's Rebellion, you have people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and frankly, Washington really having the sense that we need something stronger than the Articles of Confederation. But from Washington's perspective, he fought and won the American Revolution as our general. He did the amazing thing of giving up military power, and he retired to Mount Vernon. He's an internationally famous person, beloved by his countrymen and women, beloved around the world, marveled at around the world. And so for George Washington at this founding moment, there's really a sense of a lot to lose and not a lot to gain, I would say, for him. It's almost impossible for Washington's reputation to go up, and there's great peril in trying to construct a new government. And so as we talk about Shay's Rebellion, think about people like Hamilton and people like Madison trying to convince Washington that we really do need a national government. And eventually, as we move towards a convention, we need you at the convention because you are the indispensable person. So that's Washington. Where does Shay's Rebellion fit in? Well, Shay's Rebellion, we would zoom in to Western Massachusetts.
And Hamilton. I'm just going to give you Hamilton.
Yes, absolutely. I have Hamilton here too. Hamilton, who is again one of the big voices for a strong national government, big voices for a new constitution, big voices for having a national government that can do the things he sees European powers, the great powers, able to do: raise armies, protect us, regulate the economy, build a great nation. This is all Hamilton, and Hamilton knows the Articles of Confederation are not up to this task. And for him, and for Madison and for Washington and for a lot of these supporters of national power, Shay's Rebellion highlights just how weak the national government is. So who is Daniel Shays? Well, Daniel Shays is a person in Massachusetts. He's a farmer. He fought in the American Revolution. He fought at Lexington. He fought at Bunker Hill. And he's part of this class of farmers in Western Massachusetts, but are there throughout the United States, who many of them former soldiers, who, again, have a lot of debt, are forced to pay high taxes, have no money, and who have the courts in their respective states trying to take away their farms, trying to throw them in debtors' prisons. They have serious problems. And what they see is, many state governments not hearing their voice, not trying to deal with their problems. Obviously, the national government isn't, but the state governments aren't either, at least in many of these states. And so in Massachusetts, it's Daniel Shays, this former Revolutionary War soldier, coming together with other farmers in Western Massachusetts, many of them soldiers as well, and marching throughout the state. And so what they're doing is they're taking control of courthouses and making sure that judges can't take away people's farms. They're closing down debtors' prisons and making sure that people can't be thrown in there. And they're also plotting to take taking the military arms of the state from the arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, and marching on Boston, because they want it to be clear that the state government is not hearing their voice, and it must. And so for someone like Washington, I know you have Hamilton there, but for someone like Washington, he sort of, he both sees the threat, but he can also empathize with these voices. He remembers when he fought in the American Revolution, when he led the forces in the American Revolution, his own soldiers not getting paid, threatening mutiny, and really the national government not honoring their responsibilities and their duties to honor the service of these soldiers. So he can understand why these people in Western Massachusetts are concerned and are angry and are marching. On the other hand, though, what's the end result of Shay's rebellion? The national government can't do anything. The national government can't require the states to send in troops. They can't really raise an army of their own. And who puts down Shay's rebellion? It's a Massachusetts militia. It's not the national government. And this is terrifying for so many figures who are central to the national government. Washington, one of them, Hamilton, Madison, Benjamin Franklin, all of these people very concerned that this could just be the opening act of many acts of violence, with, on the one hand, the national government having no power to raise the force necessary to put it down, but also none of the power and discretion necessary to pass policies that can address people's genuine concerns. And so we're on the precipice of disaster here, Kerry. And so and we'll go back, I guess, to your initial question, which is, so what sort of happens? Well, Shay's rebellion and Madison and Hamilton and this moment convince Washington that it's worth the risk. I have a lot to risk in terms of my professional reputation, but there's way more risk involved in what could be the future of America. And here, what we're eventually doing is we're forming a convention to tear up the Articles of Confederation and put a new government in place. And one of the key reasons why people can take that seriously, know that it's a serious convention and that it's something that they, have to seriously weigh, is precisely because figures like Washington, figures like Benjamin Franklin, who you're near over there, Kerry, these figures of international stature, these figures beloved of America, stake their own personal reputations on the Constitutional Convention and eventually on the United States Constitution.
So real quickly, we're going to play like a seek and find. I put the painting of the Constitutional Convention on the screen. Just so you guys know, the room that we're in was designed to have the same window openings as the room at Independence Hall, which was the Pennsylvania State House at the time, which is only, by the way, a block away. If I could hoof it over there and walk you guys through, maybe that's next time we do this class. But if you look at the painting, you can see Washington at the front. You can see Ben Franklin here in like what looks like a blue leisure suit, which I absolutely love. But I'm gonna, so Ben Franklin, he's 81 years old. And just so you can see him, here he is right beside me with the Pennsylvania delegation. A lot of people were asking about like how many statues, how many people are in the room. Lorelai, I say the same thing. So there's 42 statues in the room. There's 3 people, they're dissenters, which you can see behind here, and I'll show you in a minute, who refused to sign the Constitution on September 17th, which is the last day of the convention. The rest of them did sign. They're pretty much grouped by how they would have been standing on the moment of the signing of the Constitution. So Washington at the front, Madison right beside him. Hamilton is kind of like in the middle as an outlier, because he always was, walking very like chin up towards the front of the room. And if you don't know anything about Hamilton, you feel it in his statue. You're like, oh, I asked like little kids. I'm like, what do you think about this guy? They're like, he kind of looks full of himself. I'm like, you're not wrong. So that's what I love about the statues. It's like they captured the people. On a funny side note, Washington's statue is, as Tom said, it's the highest point of the room. He's 6'2". People were like this in life with Washington. They would walk up to him. They wouldn't get too close to him. He had a very like kind of distant, kind of regal feel to him. You see it when people walk into the building too. They walk into this room and they say back from Washington and they don't touch him. They're all over Ben Franklin. You can see how shiny he is because everybody rubs Ben Franklin, but nobody will touch Washington. It cracks me up. So it's really funny. I will tell you a side story and then we'll get back to the convention. This guy's Gouverneur Morris. He's one of my favorite, and Tom can tell you a little bit about like kind of we the people and this idea of having the people's voice and agency into the Constitution. But he actually did at the end of the convention. They were done. They signed. Who signed? The guys who didn't sign, and they go out to dinner, and they're having food. They're having some drinks, and Hamilton talks Gouverneur Morris. This is how the story goes. He says, "Gouverneur, Washington's so excited. He's so happy. You should go throw your arm around him and give him a big huzzah, like cheers." And Gouverneur Morris like walks over and he's like, yeah, and he's a big guy. That's why they have him leaning over. He talked to Franklin a lot, but also so he would be lower than Washington. So he goes over, he throws his arm around Washington, and he says the look that Washington gave him could have stopped his heart in a moment. And he looks over at Hamilton, and Hamilton's cracking up in the corner because he knew that would happen. So little humanity, these people are fallible, these people have issues, and I tee that up because we want to think about them as real people, and they're not perfect. Because we're going to talk about the compromises next and what compromises they made in that long, hot summer from May 25th to September 17th, and why some of the men in the room refused to sign it, and a little bit about the fact that they're all men in the room. They're all white men in the room, and wealthy white men on top of that too. So we need to talk about all of the humanity, the good and the bad, and that they're not, don't think of them as statues that you can only think are perfect as well. So there's my funny story to get into fallibility.
Well, that is one of my favorite stories too. I'm glad you shared that one. And I mean, Gouverneur Morris is an example, and we could do this with so many people in the room of figures that we don't really think much about today as, our founders, but were such important figures at the convention. Morris spoke more than nearly any other delegate there. As Kerry said, he was one of the main advocates of a strong national government, but also a government by we the people. So this idea of popular sovereignty. Morris himself was the key figure also on what was called the Committee of Style near the end of the convention, which really put together the final draft of the Constitution. And so many people who study Gouverneur Morris think of him as the main author of the final text of the Constitution, including the powerful preamble. And then finally, Kerry, he was also one of the strongest opponents of slavery, speaking out against slavery at the Constitutional Convention. And he's a classic example of, past is not necessarily prologue in that he's the voice of we the people, but he was a wealthy landowner from New York City. And so, these are all very, very complex, complicated figures. So Kerry, what should we tick through the compromises? Is that the best?
Yeah, let's tick through the compromises, and maybe we can highlight a few people at the time as we go through the compromises, and I'll share the kind of the list that we have of compromises so we can all look at them together. And really quickly, just so we know, when Tom was talking about the beginning of the Constitution, the preamble begins with we the people, and then you move on to the articles in the Constitution, and there's a total of 7. I always think it's going to be 8 and 7. And then we get to what were some of the big compromises, because what I love about the compromises is it shows you how the 7 articles work together in different ways, especially the first 3, but really kind of say this isn't just 1, 2, 3, 4 like steps that you go through, but this is really a system that they wrote, a systematic game board instructions. And the game that we're playing is the United States government. So how do they work together, and how do they get to these really hard balancing acts between what they individually valued or their state valued and what they valued for a whole nation, and writing that into it, and valuing of the individual as well. So Connecticut Compromise, I can find Sherman. We go through. Go ahead. You start, I'll find them.
No, absolutely. And I saw one question about Gouverneur Morris, someone asking, he was originally from New York. He then moved to Pennsylvania after, I believe, he lost his re-election bid for Congress, and then moved back to New York later. So he went between those 2 states. But let's begin with the Connecticut Compromise. This is the big debate between large states and small states over how we were going to structure Congress, how political power was going to be divided in Congress as to the different states. And the key figure here, it's the Connecticut Compromise or Great Compromise. The key figure here is the delegate from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, which is right, he's right behind Kerry there, sort of plainly dressed. Sherman himself was the second oldest member of the Constitutional Convention. If you're looking at the delegates as a whole, they were really, really young. Most of them were in their 30s and 40s. The average age was 42. Franklin was the oldest. He was in his early 80s, and Sherman was in his mid 60s. And so Sherman is this amazing figure where he signed the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he was on the Declaration of Independence Committee. He signed the Articles of Confederation and would play a key role at the convention and sign the Constitution itself. And he was someone who forged many different compromises, depending on your, some good, some bad, but was this central figure. And also, although we don't talk about him a lot today, after Madison, after James Wilson, another forgotten founder, Sherman was one of the most active people in debates on the floor of the convention. So he's a really, really important figure. I love this description. I'll get to the substance of the compromise in a moment, but this is a great description by the late historian Rick Beeman, who's a great historian of the Constitutional Convention. How did he describe Sherman? He said, the plainly dressed, awkwardly formed, but wise delegate from Connecticut would play an enormously important role in the convention, speaking more frequently than any other delegate except Gouverneur Morris and Madison. And so he's this really, really key, important figure. And so what is the Connecticut Compromise? Well, first you have to understand what came before it. There are two opposing views. This is the big debate over congressional representation, whether we're going to have Congress, the members of Congress set by the population of the states or by equal state representation, every state getting the same number of representatives. If we're looking back to the Articles of Confederation, the Congress there was organized by equality of the states. So whether you're a big state like Virginia or a small state like Connecticut, in the Articles of Confederation, you all had the same political power, you all had one vote. And so what we see here in the debates over congressional representation at the Constitutional Convention is, on the one hand, figures like James Madison and Pennsylvania's James Wilson, both strong advocates of Congress being organized by population. So if you're a large state, you get more representatives. If you're a small state, you get fewer representatives. And it shouldn't surprise us that these figures would support this, because on the one hand, it benefits their states. Pennsylvania and Virginia are the largest states in the Union. So yes, they would want to go for state population. But also, it was a matter of principle for the person standing next to Kerry right now, James Wilson, Pennsylvania's James Wilson. I like to think of him as he is the voice of popular sovereignty at the convention. This is what we read, or what Kerry read for us in the preamble, this idea of government by we the people, that it's not, we the elite, we the aristocracy, it's we the people, we shape what the government does. And so Wilson believed that what's the better way to promote popular sovereignty in the Constitution than making sure that Congress is linked to population size. The political power is linked to how many people you have. So the voice of each person is represented the same way in our government. And this is so significant because for the founding generation, they assumed that Congress would be the most powerful branch of government. And that's why the convention spent more time debating this issue over how to structure power in Congress than pretty much any other. So that's the arguments of James Wilson, James Madison. This is all embodied in the famous Virginia plan, Virginia's plan of government that they presented at the beginning of the convention that framed so many debates that came afterwards. And so that's the Virginia plan, representation in Congress by population. But the small states, needless to say, didn't like this very much. And so the small states, led by William Patterson of New Jersey, and many of his small state allies said, no. There are problems with the Articles of Confederation. We do need the national government to have more power, but the Articles didn't make a mistake when it treated all states the same way. We need, if we're going to agree to this Constitution as small states, we need Congress to be organized the same way as the Articles of Confederation. Each state gets the same number of votes. So if you're big Virginia, small New Jersey, small Connecticut, you all get the same number of votes in Congress. And so the two sides battle this out. That's the Virginia plan for population, the New Jersey plan for equal state vote. And what's the Great Compromise? What's the Connecticut Compromise? What does Roger Sherman come up with? We're going to split the difference. We're going to have two houses of Congress, a U.S. House and a U.S. Senate. The U.S. House will be organized by population, like what Madison, Wilson, and the Virginia plan said. And then the Senate will be organized by state equality, each state receiving the same number of senators, much like what the New Jersey plan, William Patterson, and the Articles had in mind. And so, this is what they come up with. That's what we mean by the Great Compromise. Now, sometimes when we hear the word compromise, we think, oh, they must have had reasoned debate and come to a consensus. No, this one didn't work like that. It passed by a single vote. And Madison and Wilson were devastated. They won on the issue in the House, but they were devastated by the Senate being organized by state equality. Now, this didn't stop Madison for arguing on behalf of the whole Constitution when it came time to argue over the ratification of the Constitution. He defended the Senate as structured in the Constitution in his writings in the Federalist Papers, but they were devastated. And so that's a bit about congressional representation.
And I think it's really fascinating, Tom, to think about how people can fight for one thing during the writing of this, but then say, I need to get myself behind it for the overall passing of this as ratification. And one of the things so it's really fascinating, Madison shifts for the ideals of the good of the country and says, I defend this because this is what's best for our country. One of the things I want the students to know or to remember is that at the end of the Constitutional Convention, that the majority of people in this room sign it, 3 do not. And we're going to end on that great question from Riley about why did they not sign it, but that it goes back to the states for ratification. This is like mind-blowingly game-changing, that the best thinkers of the time, and sometimes people could say of all time great thinkers, don't make it law. They say, no, we're putting our name on it to back it, not to say that it's your law, you have to ratify it, going almost back to that we the people. So Tom, we have like a few minutes left. I'd love for you to wrap up the slavery in the Constitution real quick, those compromises, and then end on the dissenters, because the dissenters are my favorite.
That's great, Kerry. And so, obviously some of the most controversial, troubling compromises at the convention were these compromises over slavery. And so what's sort of the big takeaway on these compromises? One thing is that for those who opposed slavery at the convention, and there were many people who did, they on the one hand, they would say, we didn't write a right to property and man into the Constitution, and so explicit protections for enslaved people as property. We didn't write that into the Constitution. We made sure we didn't write the word slave or slavery into the Constitution. But what they did do, and they were open to, was providing structural protections for slavery that, in the end, would protect those interests over time. And these are, we'll talk about the two big ones here. One is what's known as the 3/5 Compromise, and the other one is known as the Slave Trade Clause. So we'll take each in turn. So the 3/5 Compromise grows naturally out of our discussion of the Great Compromise. And so the big question here is, if we're going to organize the United States House of Representatives by population, how are we then going to count enslaved people for purposes of population? And so for the slaveholding states, the argument there is that we should count enslaved people as 5/5. We should count them as full people. And so what this would do for them is it would boost their political power in the U.S. House of Representatives. It would make their overall population larger, and so therefore they would get more seats in the House of Representatives. Now, the flip side, for those who opposed slavery, many of the Northern delegates, the argument was, no. You don't treat enslaved people as human beings. You treat them as property. You perpetuate this great evil in our nation. Enslaved people, though we think they're full people, should count as 0/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation. We shouldn't count them at all for purposes of giving political power to the slaveholding states. And so you see these two sides. This debate comes up many different times at the convention. And once again, it's Roger Sherman who brokers a compromise. And so what the delegates do, they reject the slaveholders who are saying that enslaved people should count as 5/5 of a person. They reject the anti-slavery voices who say they should count as 0/5 as a person for purposes of congressional representation. And finally come around to this idea of having enslaved people count as 3/5 of a person. So somewhere in between, but more on the slaveholding side of that particular debate. And this ends up being hugely important over time, because these debates about congressional representation are all about political power. Who's going to have power in our national government? And what it did was it boosted the number of seats that slaveholding states would have in the U.S. House of Representatives, which would then boost the number of electors they would have in the Electoral College, which would in turn then boost the political power of candidates who are running for president who are defenders of slavery. And so over time, it would bend political power in the direction of the slaveholding South. The last compromise, Kerry, is the compromise over the international slave trade. And so this is this brutal, brutal practice of taking human beings from Africa, transporting them in this brutal passage across the Atlantic Ocean to be enslaved people here in the United States. And so the debate here at the convention is, what are we going to do? Are we going to give Congress the power to ban this practice? Even slaveholding states, the delegates from slaveholding states like Virginia despise the international slave trade and say, yeah, we really should get rid of that. But it's a few delegates from the Deep South, from Georgia, from South Carolina, who say, we are going to walk out of this convention if you give Congress the power to ban the international slave trade. And so with this, what does Congress come to? What does the Constitutional Convention come to here? Was that Rutledge?
Pinckney.
Oh, okay. And so the compromise here at the end is, we're going to give Congress this power eventually to ban the international slave trade, but not until 1808. And so Congress actually does ban the international slave trade on 1808. But in the meantime, between the convention and the 1808, we have another 200,000 people coming from Africa to become enslaved people in the United States, which is almost as many people as were imported into the United States from the beginning of America to that point. And so it had great and devastating consequences.
Yeah, so great question, Iman. I'm so impressed with you knowing who's who. Both the Pinckneys are right beside each other, behind Gouverneur Morris and across from the dissenters behind me. So last question, which I believe was Riley's earlier, which was a great question, is how come some people chose not to sign it? And I moved us to end on the dissenters. These three guys, which again, from looking at them, you might say, look a little annoyed, look a little hostile, one might say. And so why are they annoyed, Tom? Why don't they sign it? Why? And they stay. I love this about them. They don't walk out. They don't ever show up. Like Rhode Island never shows up, never sends a delegate. They stay during the convention. Who are they? What were they upset about that the Constitution didn't have, to the point where they thought it was so important not to sign because it still needed more work? And then you can take us home.
Sure. So the three dissenters here are Edmund Randolph, George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry. And Kerry, you're right. They don't. Not only do they not leave the convention, but they are key figures in the debates throughout the convention. You know, Edmund Randolph of Virginia is one of the most important figures in that state, and he's the one who presents the Virginia Plan at the beginning of the convention. He's a supporter of a lot of what's going on, but ultimately doesn't sign. George Mason is involved in so many of the debates of the convention, including the Electoral College, the debates over representation, and the debates over the international slave trade. He himself a slaveholder, but opposed the international slave trade. And Elbridge Gerry, also of Massachusetts, an amazingly important figure, a skeptic of democracy and a critic of broad national power. The last thing I'll say about Mason, I'm sorry, Kerry, is he's actually George Washington's neighbor. And so the two of them were very close friends, and that Mason's eventual opposition to the Constitution, refusing to sign it, really frayed and shattered their friendship. And so there was real personal cost to George Mason to doing that. So what's the big objection? These dissenters wanted a Bill of Rights. That's the one thing when Kerry did the quick walking tour through the Constitution. The original Constitution, it's the instruction manual for our government, but there's no Bill of Rights in there. For a guy like George Mason wrote the most famous Bill of Rights in the states, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Towards the end of the convention, he says to the delegates after this sweaty, long, uncomfortable summer, just let me write a Bill of Rights. I wrote one. I'm the guy who did the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Give me a few hours, give me a few days. I can do this. And the delegates said, no, we've come here. We are not going to open this up again to debate. And so for these figures, that was a central fault. But also, you know, I would say the other critique, Kerry, is that for each of them, they were concerned about the amount of power that was being given to the national government. And that's, of course, linked to a Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights is going to protect the national government from abusing people's individual rights. But, you know, I think each of them would say that the combination of the national government having too much power and no Bill of Rights is the main reason. Now, that's not to say that they love the Articles. These are people who, again, engaged deeply in these debates at the convention and wanted something better than the Articles of Confederation, but they were willing to stand up to their friends and colleagues, people who they debated with for months, and say, no, we need a Bill of Rights.
And debate and saying this isn't right and we need to push boundaries is a healthy thing for democracy. Debate and discussion, which is what they did. So Tom, thank you so much. That was a really fun Constitutional Convention walkabout. This is great, and I love it. And students, we know we ran a little bit over, but it's a great room to play around with and get to meet the people. I asked some of our students, like, would you sign? And I have to caveat that with, would you even be able to sign? I wouldn't be able to sign, so I wouldn't have an option to do this. But thank you guys so much. It's great to have you. If you have any questions, Tom and I will hang out for a minute after class. But on that note, thanks, and have a good first week of January, right? That's what we're in?
That is what we're in. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.